This video is going to cover the topic of multiplying rational numbers. Be sure the date and topic are at the top of your page. The essential question for this video is, how do the rules for integers apply to rational numbers? And the first thing we want to address in this video is the term rational. And a rational number is any number that can be written as a fraction. And this includes whole numbers, right? Because 4, of course, could be written as the fraction 4 over 1. It could also be our more standard fractions such as 1/2 or 11/50, right? Any of these are considered rational numbers. And while integers must be whole numbers, and that could be the whole numbers that are positive or their opposites, which are negative, rational numbers can be fractional amounts. And when we talk about fractions, it's important to remember the rules for multiplying and dividing fractions. After all, we've been spending a lot of time learning the rules for multiplying and dividing whole number integers. Hopefully we remember how to multiply fractions from our work in the past, but I'll just give you a quick reminder of the basics. So here are the basics. We need to multiply the numerators, multiply the denominators, and then simplify if necessary. So for example, on this one here, I would multiply my numerators together. I would multiply my denominators together, which would give me 15/24. But of course 15 and 24 can both be divided by 3, so I would end up with a final answer of 5/8. Right? My answer would be 5/8. Now, since we've been working with integers, both positive and negative, we're just now going to apply those rules to fractions. And the rules are the same, right? A negative times a positive is a positive times a negative is a negative, and a negative times a negative is a positive. So that means we would add perhaps a step 4, which would be when we have positive and negative fractional amounts, to decide what our product would be, whether it's positive or negative. Now, if you recall, dividing fractions is very much related to multiplying, but there's one kind of first step that we have to do before we use our multiplication algorithm. And that is, before we use our multiplication algorithm, we need to first use the reciprocal of the divisor, which of course in non-formal math talk means that you flip the second fraction. That should just say fraction, don't worry about that S there, fraction. So for example, if we have 1/2 divided by 4/5, we would keep 1/2 the same. We would flip the second fraction, and then we would use the multiplication algorithm to complete this. So we would do 1 times 5 is 5, 2 times 4 is 8, and of course in this case, I got the same answer by happenstance. In this case, we would just have our final answer of 5/8. There's no simplifying required. But again, the purpose of this video is to incorporate our work with positives and negatives. So again, you might have a third step, which is that you're going to incorporate our positive and negative multiplication rules and division rules while we are working with fractions as well. So now, let's try some of these out with a series of questions. So in our first practice question here, we have -3/4 times 7/8. And I would just use my multiplication algorithm as normal. So 3 times 7 is 21. 4 times 8 is 32. But then I'm trying to decide if my answer should be positive or negative. And I see that I have a negative times a positive, so my answer is going to be a negative 21/32. And there's no simplifying required on that one. So in this example, we have a -1/7 divided by a -3/4. So I'm going to keep my first fraction the same. I'm going to use the reciprocal of my second fraction. And I'm going to multiply instead of divide. So my answer will end up being 4/21, which can't be simplified. And then I have to look to see, a negative times a negative is a positive. So this is just a regular positive 4/21. We're going to practice a few more. Try them at your own speed by pausing the video, and then we'll meet back up to check our work. So I've thrown up a couple practices here. I want you to try these first before you unpause your video. So go ahead and jot these down. Be thinking about what operation it is, so which part you need to do first. And also be thinking about whether the sign, if we're using this little model here to help us remember, whether your answer is going to be either a negative or a positive. So give those a few moments on your own, and then we'll come back and we'll see how you did. On your first one, you should have gotten 3/8, but of course it's a positive times a negative, so it's negative 3/8. The next one was also multiplication, so I just multiplied straight across. 3 times 4 is 12, 5 times 7 is 35. But in this case, we had a negative times a negative, so our answer ended up being positive 12/35. The next one was division, so first I kept my first fraction the same, and then I multiplied by the reciprocal, and I had 6 times 5, which was 30, and 7 times 1, which was 7, but a positive times a negative meant it was negative 37ths. But of course then this one was able to be simplified, right? Right now it's an improper fraction, so I turned it into a mixed number above by keeping it negative, but changing it into negative 4 and 2/7. And the last example here was also division. So I kept the first fraction the same. I multiplied by the reciprocal and I got 35ths, but it's a negative times a positive in the end. So I ended up having a negative result. But of course, negative 30 divided by 5 is quite simply a negative 6. So the answer here was negative 6. So how'd you do on your first 4 practice problems? Make sure you're being honest with yourself and making any corrections you need to. I'm going to put up one more question each, one multiplication and one division, that I'd like you to solve on your own and bring with you to class. So take some time to solve these last 2 questions. Make sure you're following the rules for multiplying and dividing fractions, and then also applying our rules that we've added this year about using negative and positive numbers together. Remember that the essential question of this video was, how do we apply rules for integers when we are multiplying and dividing rational numbers? Hopefully this was a good little refresher on multiplying and dividing fractions, and now you can see how we apply those same integer rules to our fractions.